Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Christina Cleveland. I'm the Senior Director of Talent Development Solutions at Canadian Management Centre, and I'm here to welcome you on our webinar for Responding to Conflict, Effective Leadership Techniques. We have over 1,700 participants from across the country, so we're very excited to welcome you to participate today. For those of you who are returning to our webinar series, welcome back. And for those of you who are new to CMC, just a brief introduction about who we are and what we do. Canadian Management Centre is a national organization committed to developing the next generation of leaders. So we are a talent transformation company, and we do offer our programs across the country in a number of different areas, ranging from management and leadership to communication skills to project management, sales management, and a variety of other topics. So conflict is definitely a topic that we've heard as being of interest to leaders across this country and professionals, and that's why we've selected it as a topic today. So for those of you who have participated with us before, you are aware that we do try to tweet live during the events as well, so feel free to join us in the conversation and spreading the word about what we're talking about today using the hashtag CMC events, and you can follow us at Canadian Management. We will be sending you a link after today's session, so we do record these sessions. We will also summarize any questions and answers that we'll be receiving through the session, and we'll send you a follow-up email. So as you've registered for the session, you will automatically receive that email, so it'll give you access to the PowerPoint slides as well as a recording of the session, so you can feel free to pass that along. So just rest assured that that will come to you later on this week. And now we'll head into the topic. We want to spend as much time as we possibly can getting into this really heavy topic of conflict. And we wanted to start off with why we've selected this topic today. And one of the reasons that we initiate these webinars is so that we can give our clients access to information that is of interest to them in these people development areas and interpersonal skills related subject matters. So conflict came up as a request in terms of feedback from our clients. And you will have an opportunity to provide us with some feedback about other topics you're interested in the future. But we chose this particular topic because of the sensitivity around managing these situations, but also because research is indicating that it is a very important and significant topic. So based on a 2008 Human Capital report by CPP Global, which actually was just published again in 2012 in an article discussing conflict management, it indicated that 85% of employees experience conflict. So the results of the survey are based on responses from 5,000 full-time employees in 9 countries. So conflict happens around the world. The average employee spends 2.1 hours a week dealing with conflict situations. So if you think about yourself, if you've ever been in a conflict situation, how time-consuming it can be, how emotionally draining these events can be, the impact on employee engagement, frustration, the limits to productivity, limits to innovation. If you take 2.1 hours a week dealing with conflict and multiply that by the number of employees in your organization, clearly there's wasted effort and untapped potential. And 70% of these survey respondents saw managing conflict as an important leadership skill. So leaders either are dealing with conflicts themselves, or they're called into situations where they may need to facilitate conflicts between one or more employees or respective departments or teams. So clearly it's an important topic that we wanted to address for leaders today. So joining me, my partner in conflict, is Michelle White. Michelle is a CMC facilitator who has spent the last 20 years sharing best practices in management and interpersonal skills with business leaders in a variety of different industries. She herself has held senior positions in organizational development and human resources in the government, telecommunications, and retail industries. She's currently full-time professor of human resources at Fanshawe College in London, Ontario. And in addition, she designs and instructs courses for the traditional classroom, but she also specializes in e-learning instruction and course design. But she's been a CMC facilitator since 2006 and has delivered courses within our management, leadership, and communications portfolio. So I'm really excited to welcome her back today to join me for this particular topic. So Michelle and I will be inviting some interaction from you as well. So using WebEx, if you're new to WebEx, you will notice a chat panel in the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And Michelle and I will be calling on you to participate by contributing any ideas and suggestions through that chat panel, and also submitting any questions that you have as well. So Michelle, are you there? I think we might have you on mute still. Are you there now?
I am, and thank you very much, Christina. And welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to share some best practices in how to manage conflict. And we're going to start with the definition of conflict so that we're all aligned with what conflict is. And we're going to refine this a little further by looking at disagreement versus conflict and where they differ and when a disagreement can lead to a conflict. We'll also develop conflict awareness by looking at the 5 levels of conflict, and then we'll discuss the impact of conflict on employee engagement so we understand the business impact if conflicts are not managed. We'll then share some approaches to help you manage conflict and provide you with some do's and don'ts to consider when actually responding to conflict. So let's get started with an informal definition of conflict. Conflict is informally defined as personality clashes, breakdowns in working relationships, disputes in groups, and meetings and other situations. It can be a major or even a minor conflict, but it's usually the result of some process or series of events that have not been addressed. Now, that's why the word breakdown is so important in that definition. It speaks to the idea that it is a process and how it's multi-step, and that is the foundation of most conflict. So given that a conflict can build over time, it can be different than just a typical disagreement. Now, as we look at disagreements versus conflict, it's important to remember that we're not talking generally about a difficult conversation, but more specifically about a conflict. A difficult conversation typically can involve disclosing some unpleasant information or news, but it doesn't have to lead to a disagreement or a conflict. Now, disagreements generally result from differing viewpoints, values, or opinions. So for example, you and a coworker experience a meeting together. You think the meeting was effective and even exciting. Your coworker felt the meeting was a waste of time and slow-moving. So why do your opinions differ? Well, we often tend to rely on the facts to confirm who's right. However, there can be disagreements even about the facts themselves or about the interpretation of those facts. So when opinions actually come into play, you can't rely on facts. And disagreements may escalate actually into conflict if they're not managed properly. So when discussing disagreements, demonstrating open, friendly, and cooperative communication is usually best. Because your main goal is to understand the other person's interpretation and to see it from their point of view. If you continue to disagree after a mutual exploration of views, then usually you both just tend to, as we like to say, agree to disagree. Now, a disagreement can actually turn into a conflict when it becomes charged with emotional or intense feelings. Conflicts don't just go away. Now, they may lay dormant, or they may be ignored for a while because there's more pressing concern or agenda, but they don't disappear without an active work towards a resolution. So now we'd actually like to hear from you. What are some causes of conflict in the workplace?
Thanks, Michelle. So we're going to invite participation through that chat panel. So again, in the bottom right-hand side of your screen, feel free to submit your ideas here about what you believe some of the causes are of conflict in the workplace. And, Michelle, I know when you were talking about disagreement versus conflict, and we're saying, we have to take time to potentially put ourselves in experiencing the situation from another person's point of view, which can be difficult when emotions are at play, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So we've got a lot of responses coming in. We've got people saying differing values, different personalities, cultural differences, power struggles between departments, unclear expectations, job insecurity, lack of clear roles. I don't think anybody's experienced conflict based on some of these details coming in. Expectations, different objectives, again, responsibilities about who's accountable for a specific issue. So lots of different causes coming in. Okay, some more uncertainty about a person's role or the future, different work ethics, not being recognized for good work but potentially being criticized. I can see why that could cause conflict. Lack of communication, overlapping responsibilities. So we've definitely got some clear themes coming through here. So if we move forward and we think about the summary of causes of conflict in terms of some popular research that's been done by CMC, Michelle, where does that land in terms of a quick summary of causes of conflict?
Well, from what I'm seeing from the responses here, a lot of us have experienced similar causes of conflict, and the list that we have up now is quite typically what causes a lot of conflict. And you know, when you think about it, disagreements result from differing views or values, and so many of these causes can actually be disagreements that haven't yet been managed. There was one, though, that as we were going through the list and you were reading some, Christina, one that resonated with me a little bit was the idea of the uncertainty of a person's role. And some other folks wrote down role ambiguity and that sort of thing. And I think when we look at it from a management perspective, as managers and leaders, one of the things that we also have to keep in mind is good, solid performance management practices actually help define roles, and that in and of itself can also help to avoid conflicting situations.
And just one other comment that came in was lack of emotional intelligence, Michelle. So, you know, in terms of that point that we were saying about seeing a situation from another person's perspective, can you just touch on emotional intelligence and how that plays into potential cause of conflict?
Certainly. When you look at conflict, and we'll discover further as we explore conflict a little bit more, you know, the role of emotions, you know, it's a significant role in conflict. And of course, with emotional intelligence, it's not just being able to detect the emotions in others, but it also has us looking at our own emotional state and understanding our own emotional motivations, because at times we'll find ourselves communicating in a certain way, and we might not think we're being emotional, but really some of our hot buttons or, you know, some of our deepest values that, let's say, we feel threatened and we communicate in an emotional way. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to actually take a look. We're going to explore conflict awareness a little bit further here. Now, in order to further develop our awareness, I'd like to examine the 5 levels of conflict. And when we're thinking about it in terms even of an emotional intelligence perspective, we can even see where maybe the emotions can inject themselves into these different levels as we go through. So now, sometimes conflicts arise and we're not even aware of how they started. And other times we clearly understand the cause of the conflict. Earlier we talked about how conflict is, you know, most typically a process or a series of events. And this process is actually a progression through 5 levels. At each level, there's an opportunity for a conflict to be avoided if the thoughts and behaviors at that level are actually addressed. So why don't we start with level 1? And level 1 is discomfort. Now, when you have discomfort, there's usually something about the relationship or the situation that just doesn't feel right. You can't quite put your finger on it, but you feel uneasy. And at level 2, there is some type of an episode. Maybe an exchange occurs which leaves you upset, irritated, or angry. At level 3, we have the disagreement stage. Now here, differences are debated, feelings are guarded, the other person's viewpoint is maybe diminished, and information is vague. Others notice but want to distance themselves from the problem, and you are only worried about you. The more emotional things get, you start to obtain this inward focus, as it were. Now at level 4, there's anxiety. The relationship now becomes a source of worry. You begin to see differences as distorted. People choose sides and seek supporters. Feelings can be tense, and the other person's views are rejected. And you start to become more concerned with just protecting yourself. Now, level 5, which is the last level, is the critical turning point. The conflict has escalated. Individuals feel threatened. Feelings become either, frozen or hysterical. and there is a total rupture in the relationship, possibly leading to maybe leaving a job, and winning starts to become the contest. At this level, people tend to dig their heels in as there is a lot of emotional equity at stake at this point. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to think about a current or a recent conflict that you've been involved in. Can you identify what level it reached on our model? Can you trace the development of the conflict by identifying clues at the earlier levels? It's an important question to ask yourself when you look at conflict escalation. Because conflicts, they typically escalate because we're either unwilling to address and manage them at an early stage. Sometimes we hope they'll just disappear, or perhaps the other person doesn't feel the same way we do and there really is no conflict. But there's anger, feelings of being right or justified, enjoyment of winning. These are additional views that encourage us not to address the conflict. So from this model, at which level do you think it's easiest to take actions that will prevent conflict from escalating? If you thought that maybe level 1 or 2 would be the right levels, you are certainly correct. Once a conflict escalates to level 3, it's more difficult to manage because more of your feelings, such as pride or fear or resentment, that sort of thing, and a personal need for protection are all at risk. So you'll find these types of emotions when looking at the barriers to managing conflict. I'm just actually taking a look at the chat board here, and there's a little discussion going on about whether we should compromise and what that looks like. We're going to go through a model, a little systematic approach to deal with conflict in a little while, and then perhaps some of these concerns that I see coming up on the chat board will be addressed. So let's take a look at barriers to managing conflict. As a manager or leader, conflict management is the art of redirecting, reducing, or managing disagreements between and among people. Coping with conflict means coping with the way people perceive and how they feel. Now, feelings can drown out rational arguments, and I can't stress enough, if you don't harmonize the feelings, you will not manage the conflict. So here's a list of some of the barriers that can interfere with managing conflict. Now, many of you can likely add more from your own experience, but just take a quick look at these here. Now, the first one is the act of ignoring the conflict, just hoping it'll go away. Well, guess what? The chances that the conflict will go away are certainly very slim. Depending on what's at stake, you're going to need to find a way to work through the situation just to find some sort of resolve. Now, the second barrier is threats to one's self-esteem. Now, these can be either real or imagined threats, but one feels threatened. And you need to have the courage to deal with difficult situations. If you're respectful and honest, you'll create an environment where people will be willing to do the same. Because when we feel under attack, our instinct is to defend. So we must approach the situation from a balanced perspective. Now, the third barrier here is the misunderstanding of values, culture, generation, gender, style, things that actually help us define who we are as people. So if somebody misunderstands those aspects of our personality and of ourselves, again, we can start to feel threatened or perhaps under attack. So it's important to always assume positive intent. When we do so, we're willing to take some ownership over the situation and to respect and value our differences rather than translating them into a point of conflict. So in other words, assume that the person that you are having this discussion with, that their heart's in the right place and they're coming at it from a not an attacking viewpoint, and it can help us to open up to understand their position. Now, number 4 is hidden agendas. The outward message may be that a plan is good for the group, but there's an ulterior motive. perhaps for personal gain behind the plan. So you have to be wary of those things. Now there's also teasing, put-downs, and negative judgments, and intimidation and inappropriate use of power. These are all behaviors that are usually driven by emotions. So we want you to keep this in mind when we look at how to manage conflict later on in the webinar.
Yeah, so Michelle, before we move on to the next slide, we have again some great discussion coming in on the chat panel, so thanks everyone for contributing their thoughts and ideas. We had a question about, earlier when we talked about barriers to conflict, a question came in about what does harmonize the feelings mean. So I'm just wondering if you might just expand on that a little bit in terms of what our intention is around harmonizing the feelings so that you can manage the conflict.
Certainly. Yeah, when we're looking at harmonizing the feelings, I think what tends to happen is we try to we're not trying to avoid the feelings, but it's always a difficult thing when people decide to express how they feel. So when you're actually discussing harmonizing it, we're talking about the other party sharing how they feel, and then you also sharing how you feel. And so, in essence, the two of you together can start to understand each other's position. And so when we're talking about harmonizing, we're really talking about a way that perhaps you can both find yourselves to, use the musical analogy to stay on that same scale, as it were, and see if you can't use your differences and your feelings to work together to, create notes that actually work. Does that help?
Yeah, I think that helps. I think really what we're trying to do is create an opportunity to open up the dialogue, start to rebuild a path for communication, and that takes, in some cases, rebuilding of trust. We've had people commenting about courage might not, courage is what it takes to be able to manage conflict, but not having it could potentially be a barrier. And lack of support could also potentially be a barrier to managing conflict effectively in the workplace also. So whether that's support of your senior leaders, support of upper management on a particular point of view, that you need their support in order to be able to get some resolve in some cases. But I love what you said about assuming positive intent, Michelle. I think that we can only control ourselves in a conflict situation, right? We can't control the other person. So when we assume positive intent with the other person, it puts us in a different state of clarity to start to evaluate the situation and to get ourselves into an objective state of mind.
Certainly. And I see in the chat board here someone saying about wanting people to all be singing from the same song sheet, to go with the harmonized analogy.
Yeah,
which is a great summary of that. Excellent. So we're just going to take a look now, as we can see on the slide here, we're going to look at the impact that conflict has on employee engagement. And if there's actually, to share a little information with you here, there's a 2010 study of employee engagement in the Canadian workplace, where they surveyed close to 400 Canadian HR professionals working in business, government, consulting, education, and not-for-profit organizations. And they actually found that 69% indicated that employee engagement is a problem in their organizations. Now, disengaged employees don't necessarily quit in droves or just, walk away from the organization. It appears that disengaged employees don't leave their organizations in many cases. They often stay and may damage both productivity and relationships. So, what's the impact on that? Well, the immediate impact is the financial cost of turnover. It's typically 1 times the annual salary of the person who's left, so that can be a very costly venture. But for those who stay, there are certainly long-term consequences. So absenteeism is certainly one of them. Disengaged employees are absent or late for work more often. Productivity. Disengaged employees are marginally productive, leaving others to pick up the slack. Now, this is demonstrated through poor performance or missed deadlines or poor quality. In general, the employee, when they're disengaged, they just don't give you their discretionary effort. They come to work and they do the job, but their hearts and minds, aren't in alignment. Their heart is not in it. And that actually becomes even more evident in something like customer service. There's inefficiency, poor service, or inconsistency from disengaged employees toward customers, and that can cause damage to your brand and the company's reputation. Now, and this isn't always evident. These things happen subtly, and I'd like to use the example sometimes. Let's say you go to a restaurant, and as a customer, you find yourself sitting there, and technically you are getting perfect service. The drink is coming when the drink is supposed to come. The appetizers are coming when the appetizers are supposed to come. But there's something about the server that just doesn't connect with you. They just slam the plate down on the table that little bit too hard, or they just don't offer up that smile, or their voice doesn't come across in a caring manner. Those are the types of things that start to erode the service, and disengagement really does manifest itself in those types of behaviors, especially with your customers. Then there's also morale. Disengaged employees are often negative, and they'll overtly complain to those around them, and that can actually start to depress the satisfaction of other employees. And then last but not least, there's certainly leader frustration. When you have disengaged employees, they command your time and attention, and what happens is you start finding yourself focusing only on the poor performers rather than those who would truly benefit from your support and coaching. So it does have an impact on the team.
And we have a question from a participant, Michelle, about whether or not conflict reduces employee engagement, or if it's the other way around, or if it's a cycle. Like, how do the two really come together between conflict and disengagement?
I think, well, a disengaged employee, they certainly work hand in hand. And what you'll find is, especially conflicts that haven't been addressed. So really, a conflict shouldn't lead to disengagement because a conflict should be managed. But unmanaged conflicts can certainly lead to disengagement. Now, can an employee's disengaged behaviors actually create conflict? It can. It can because, for example, if an employee is often late for work and the rest of the team has to pick up the slack, that can start to create ill will and hard feelings and that sort of thing. So then it's the manager's role to be alert to that and to make sure that they manage that before, again, it becomes a conflict. So really, it's all a process, and it's just how you're in tune to the different parts of the process. Going back to our 5 levels of conflict, you try to get it at levels 1 and 2, but disengagement does create levels 1 and 2 on a more consistent basis.
Yeah, that's great, Michelle, and I would support that 100%, that it can be a cycle where conflict can cause disengagement, and disengagement could potentially lead to situations where conflict ends up being the result or outcome. You just think about the amount of frustration that happens in a conflict scenario, whether it's because you don't understand why something's being done a certain way, you don't understand another person's behavior, why they're doing the things that they're doing. If we're coming at it by not assuming positive intent, that frustration just continues to escalate and continues to evolve into a conflict situation. Definitely.
Definitely. And actually, I was thinking maybe this would be a good time to ask the group for another question. What do you think, Christina?
I think so, yeah. So we're going to open up a poll for the participants to respond to. It's going to be opening up on the right-hand side of your screen, and it's just to get a sense of what your current approach is for managing conflict. And we all have different styles and approaches to managing conflict situations. And for some of us, how we manage conflict may change at home versus how we handle it in a work situation. But we've got a couple responses up there. So you either try and avoid it and hope it'll go away, try to focus on agreements in order to minimize the conflict, asking directly what the person has a conflict with, discussing your concerns and a proposed solution, or you may be one of the very fortunate of that 15% that doesn't experience any conflict in your work environment. So just go ahead and click off your response to what your current approach is for managing a conflict situation, and the results are going to post up again on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll see what the general feel is for the group. But we've had, again, some really great discussions going on in the chat panel with folks, people who are may end up in situations where they are managing the conflict themselves or they're in conflict on their own. But it sounds like we have a good percentage of the audience who actually addresses the conflict. So 45% of those who are online today discuss your concerns and a proposed solution with the individual. So lots of courage in handling those situations. And second most popular response, 28%, I try to focus on agreements in order to minimize the conflict. So I guess it's where some discussion happens about how we can get to a win-win situation and a compromise. And I know that there was a participant earlier commenting on compromise not necessarily being a losing situation. So thanks all for contributing your thoughts onto the poll there. So Michelle, our responses, we've got some very brave folks on the line. So 45% of the group discuss their concerns and a proposed solution with the individual.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. And actually, as we're going to now go through a systematic approach that you may want to look at when looking at conflict. And so for 45% of you, you're certainly, well, for all of us, we're probably intuitively we're all on the right track. But when we see this 45%, I think some of the pieces of our next model will resonate with you. And it's actually called the AEIOU Model. And this is a 5-step model that can be used to help diffuse a conflict situation. Now, following the steps in sequence will provide you with a consistent approach to manage conflict. So we're going to actually take a look at each step more closely, and we're going to start with A, which is to acknowledge the other person. Now, conflicts generally start from a misunderstanding or a disagreement. Either way, you need to acknowledge the other individual's concerns before you can move forward in this process. If we were in a workshop right now, what I would do is I would walk behind the individual and probably say we need to look at things from this point of view, from what they're seeing. So if you can get that perspective, that's certainly the best first step in managing conflict. So stating, and you also, what is helpful is stating your intention for the conversation, just to create safety for the other person to listen. And that way you'll encourage them to share their perspective. So for example, you may say something like, you know, it's really important to me personally and to our team that I have a good working relationship with you. This may encourage them to actually to come forward. And next in the model would be E, which is to express your concerns. Now, you have a point of view in all of this as well. So in order for you to feel heard, you also need the opportunity to express your concerns. Now, however, you also want to appeal to the other person's needs in the situation. Now, you gained some insight into the other person's needs in the acknowledge step previously. So these are the first two areas where you can now start to harmonize those feelings as we discussed earlier. So, for example, you may say something like, you know, lately you've not been meeting deadlines that we mutually agreed upon. I'm concerned when deadlines are missed as it jeopardizes the team's ability to meet performance objectives and it stresses the team's relationships. So now, once you've actually acknowledged the other person and expressed your concerns, you're going to want to identify a proposal or a plan. Now here you want to make it clear what you need as a result of the conversation. For example, you know, approval to proceed with a project, change in specific behaviors within a particular time frame, agreement to work as partners on completing a task. Now don't be vague and don't assume your listeners know what you're thinking. You need to make your intention and desired result clear. And this is a key factor. And I find that, you know, going back to our conversation when we were, you know, saying how performance management practices are, you know, play a role as well in managing conflict. Again, always making your intentions and what your expectations are of your employees clear will certainly help and will help you in this phase of the of managing the conflict. So, you know, the proposal or plan that you come up with, though, needs to be representative of each of your issues. So, for example, you may say, you know, we need to look at your workload and deadlines and decide if they're realistic. If we can agree that they are, I need all planned deadlines to be met, or for you to discuss any anticipated delay with me 1 week prior to the deadline. That way the two of you are both in full understanding of what's expected and also the behavior that's expected in the event that for some reason the objectives can't be met.
I think that's a great point, Michelle. As you mentioned that sometimes it crosses into managing performance in some of these conflict situations. And we had a comment from a participant in terms of identifying a proposal or plan that this individual indicated that they focus on what they want to achieve when in a conflict situation or trying to manage a conflict situation. So focusing on what we want to achieve, what we can agree on, can help in de-escalating the situation. So just as you said, coming at it and thinking about both of your perspectives, both issues have to be identified and both desired outcomes have to be identified and discussed. Yeah,
certainly. Certainly. And so what happens then as actually that brings us to the next point in our model here, which is the O, outline the outcome you anticipate. So here, when you're speaking, your plan should be rooted in the outcome you anticipate or require in order to reach some resolve. So how will the agreed upon plan benefit each party? And you need to be able to be prepared to address possible barriers. So for example, you may want to say something like, you know, I want both of us to feel good about working together to accomplish your project. If you miss the deadline in the future, we'll have another discussion to determine how you can manage your deadlines. But I'd like us to finish this project together. Now, after the O step, we find ourselves finally in the last stage where you want to reach an understanding. And here, you want to ensure that all parties agree on the proposal or plan as well as the intended outcome. So you can say something as simple as, you know, so how does this sound? How comfortable are you with this? And you make sure that you're continuing to get the other person's perspective. Now, in looking at this model, you know, in a real conversation, both people would be dialoguing. You know, but this serves as an example of how you can use the AEIOU model to, you know, think through what you want to say. And maybe, you know, it also prompts you to think of things like how will you handle excuses? You know, because it's also difficult to know for sure how the other person's going to respond to the conversation from an emotional perspective. And this is especially true since their perspective of the situation may be completely different than your own. But either way, when you're met with the emotion in a difficult conversation, you do want to make an effort to acknowledge the perspective of the other person. Now, you know, and this doesn't mean that you agree with their perspective or you're going to give in to their emotions. It simply means that you recognize their emotions so that you can move them past those emotions. So it's like the difference between empathy, you know, and sympathy. So in saying that, some ways from a management perspective that can help you with this, especially if you're charging into an emotionally fueled situation, is when you book time with your employee to go through this, let them know what it's about. Let them think about these things. Sometimes, you know, managers like to spring the issue on the employee and try to get their gut reaction. But if it's a situation that's evolved into a level of conflict, I think it's important to provide them with the time that they need to consider their approach and their feelings in the situation. And so, and then further to that, if you know, the emotions start to get, you know, they start to unravel in the actual meeting, you know, then you may also want to take a look at how you can manage the conversation accordingly. And we'll actually talk about that a little bit as we go into summarizing a couple of concepts. I'd like us to look at some conflict do's and don'ts.
And we're before we transition to the do's and don'ts, actually, do you mind if we go back just to the quick overview of AEIOU, just to give everybody an access to see all of those all at once again? So it's just a few slides back.
Sure.
Asking just to do a quick refresher, so that'd be great. And I've got one person commenting about the fact that, trust and respect is required as you're moving through a conflict situation. And I think, when you're talking about respect and you're talking about emotions, that, it's a sensitive situation, and people may find it difficult to be vulnerable by showing or expressing their emotions, or vulnerable because they have shown or expressed emotions. So it can be challenging to work through that. But these steps or the guidelines that you've gone through help to facilitate the process, but can be used as a planning tool as well, right?
Yeah, certainly. And what I've found for myself is anytime I have a model that I can work with, I embrace that. We all fall victim to having, an emotional view of a situation. And we need to make sure that we sit down and consider all of that. And again, that's where emotional intelligence comes in. We start to understand our cues and our hot buttons. But when you actually work through this particular model, you start to see the whole situation clinically, and you can start to separate the issue from your own emotions. Because I think one of the other things that some, leaders tend to do is they say, oh, well, I'm not emotional about that, or I don't react emotionally. But, we all have them. It's just how we manage them and come across in that particular situation. And this particular model really works well in making sure that we're focusing on the specific problem and not the emotions.
And so if someone experiences anxiety when they have to deal with a conflict situation, or may show extreme anxiety symptoms during a conversation, would you say that preparing using a model like this may help to build some confidence going into the conversation?
Oh, for sure. I actually have even instructed some folks to script it out. Actually write it out. And you won't read the script in front of the individual, of course, but sometimes even just writing it out, it causes us to think even further and take a look and start to select words that we can use that are emotionally neutral and help us with our language choice. So the physical act of writing it out can also be very, very helpful for some.
Yeah. And any other suggestions for managing anxiety in a conflict situation if someone shows extreme symptoms? Some of us have different reactions. Some of us turn red. Some of us, can't find our words. Some of us get emotional and may, show tears in some situations. Do you have any suggestions for how you might contain or manage your own emotions, let alone the emotions of the other person?
Yeah, actually, there's a little exercise that you can do when you find yourself feeling anxious, and you used some of the symptoms there, Christina, talking about, let's say you get red in the face, or, some of those other responses. A lot of those are actually physical responses. And once you become in tune to physically what's happening in your body, some people, for example, their voices are going to go really high, or other people start to speak really quickly, and all of those things. Once you start to understand what your physical cues are, what you then do is you make a concerted effort to do the opposite. So if, for example, you're in a conflict situation and your tendency, your go-to move, as it were, is to raise your voice and to lean, aggressively at the other person to, get into their space, what you do is, when you know that that's your tendency, is you do the opposite. So you try to keep your voice calm, and you try to make sure that you're in a resting position, not moving forward.
Oh, that's great. We've got some great suggestions coming in from the audience too. Folks saying take a deep breath when you're in that situation, being aware of your feelings. One participant suggesting even the location of where you go to have a discussion could have an impact. So a neutral site can sometimes be best. When there's a desk in between you, sometimes that creates a position of authority. So getting into neutral territory and getting us into a level set will allow us to resolve some of the conflict more effectively.
Yeah, certainly. And anytime you can diffuse the adversarial nature of it, and sometimes that could even be sitting more side by side. It could be a physical space issue. And across the desk, exactly, with authority. You know, so any ways that you can to just diffuse that certainly is helpful for sure.
Great. So sorry for taking us back, but based on feedback, everyone's really appreciating that, Michelle, so thanks so much. So we'll head back into do's and don'ts. And
okay.
we'll start to take some questions after that. So I know we've got quite a few in queue. If you've got questions for Michelle, feel free to submit them in the chat panel, and we'll do our best to cover off as many as we can today.
Very good. So we're going on to some conflict do's and don'ts. We're going to start with the don'ts. And you can see we have quite a comprehensive list here. Just going to touch on a couple of them. And the main thing is don't make it personal. If you allow your emotions to get out of control, you may find yourself actually attacking the other person, or you're going to try to impose your own personal values and beliefs. So here, you're going to want to watch your language choice. Try more neutral language. So, you know, for example, let's say with missed deadlines, it can be expressed as, you know, from our example earlier, you know, it jeopardizes the team's ability to meet performance objectives, as opposed to saying, you always let the team down. So you can see just simple language choice can actually have a difference. Also, don't avoid the conflict. Now, doing so can strain working relationships, which can cause employee disengagement, and it certainly can impact overall productivity. And also, you know, don't allow emotions to take over the conversation, as we talked about earlier, because if this happens, and let's say it really does get out of control, stop the meeting and agree to get back together at a later time when everyone has had a chance to cool off. And what tends to happen is when we start to get emotionally involved in the conversation, we want it to conclude when we want it to conclude. So sometimes actually trying to inject time into the situation so that both parties can cool off can be easier said than done, but it certainly is an excellent way to make sure that you're managing the conflict. So when actually looking and managing your conflict, here are some do's that you can consider. Now, we need to understand that conflicts are a part of daily life, and we should resolve to make sure that we address conflicts quickly, because as we learned in our look at the 5 levels of conflict, it's best to address it at either level 1 or level 2. So the sooner that we can address it, the better it is. And actually, by using the AEIOU model, it also helps to remind us to acknowledge how others are feeling and helps us to focus on the problem. Christina, are there any comments or questions on the do's and don'ts?
There's lots of comments, commentary coming in, actually, people relating conflict to their personal lives as well as their work lives.
Wow.
But we've got, in terms of kind of continuing with the do's and don'ts, Michelle, we've had some questions about do's and don'ts related to having a conflict with your boss. So what do you do in a situation, or what would you recommend you do in a situation where you are in a conflict situation with a superior?
Well, you know, having a conflict with someone who has an impact on your livelihood can certainly add additional stress to managing conflict. And really, that's why the AEIOU model can be so effective, even in that particular circumstance. You know, by using a systematic approach, you can still have the conversation in a calm way that will move the situation forward. And by following the steps, it helps to keep the emotions out of it. But always, when you are speaking with, you know, a boss, you want to make sure that you're assessing the conflict and making sure that it is something that you want to address. In other words, how important, I guess, is the issue to you?
Great, thanks, Michelle. We've had some requests to go back to the 5 levels of conflict. Lots of interest in this visual, so we've put it back up for folks to see the progression of the conflict. But we have some people who are asking also about team conflict situations and people who may work in a team where others are in conflict, and they're wondering how do they cope and maintain productivity when it's uncomfortable for them.
Yeah, you know, when you're faced with uncomfortable situations, it certainly is something that if you're going to enjoy what you do and enjoy going to work and enjoy working with that team, it's something you're going to want to address. So anytime you're in a situation that makes you feel uncomfortable, you need to make the parties aware of your discomfort in an effort to stop the behavior. If you feel that you certainly can't operate as an effective member of the team while this is going on, for sure. You know, so here I would always recommend a personal approach technique where you would, let's say, go up to the parties and, you know, have a conversation with them saying something like, you know, when you argue in front of the team, for example, it makes me feel uncomfortable. So, you know, I need you to stop arguing in front of the team, basically. You know, it's not your job to stop their conflict, but what you can do is you can manage how they act around you, or you can try to manage how they act around you. And it's like you're in the second level, you know, the episode level of the 5 levels of conflict, and you're dealing with the discomfort before it escalates into a disagreement of your own.
And so what about in situations, Michelle, where you may be dealing with somebody whose preference or tendency is to avoid a conflict? So even if you're at the discomfort or episode phase and you're trying to engage the individual in a conversation, but they're choosing to avoid it, or you know, passive-aggressive behaviors may come into play, how would you suggest that people manage those situations or those individuals? So you've got somebody who's choosing to avoid.
Well, you know, and this kind of puts us right up against it at this point, doesn't it? You know, we can't change how other people will act or react, but the only power we have to change is our actions and reactions. So if we've made what we feel is the best effort that we can to address the situation, and the other person, you know, knows how we feel, and if we're modeling behaviors that we want to see from the individuals, at that point, you know, that's pretty much the best that we can do. And then if it becomes problematic for other reasons and we start to see disengagement and productivity and that sort of thing, then that's where the performance management piece would come in.
Yeah. And we've got some commentary coming in, suggestions from people about, you know, respectful workplace policies, that many organizations do have respectful workplace policies that are in place, and there are opportunities to try and manage these situations respectfully early on. And, you know, Michelle and you and I were joking at the beginning that in some cases prevention is better than cure, that trying to build relationships with people that you work with in advance of getting into a conflict situation, so that that trust exists, that mutual respect exists, so that you have an opportunity to resolve conflicts more positively than getting yourself into a situation where it may turn to a critical turning point.
Yeah, certainly. And you should never, ever underestimate the power of self-disclosure. And when I say self-disclosure, I don't mean telling everybody everything, your whole business, your whole life. But, you know, in certain areas where, let's say, you know, you might say something like, you know, well, for me, I always find, and you could be speaking generically, but you're disclosing a piece of information about yourself that, as it lands on other people, they may take that into consideration when working with you in the future. So, for example, you know, to me, I always lose my patience when the technology doesn't work right away, you know, or something you're just disclosing. And then later, if you're in a meeting or a situation where the technology isn't working the way it should and you find yourself getting a little excited, I think sometimes people will draw back on that and go, well, you know, Michelle, she's always said she loses her patience when the technology doesn't work. So it's that kind of thing.
Well, we've had a request to go back to take another look at the conflict don'ts from a participant, Michelle, and I know that, you know, we've talked about avoidance and we've talked about emotions that can come into play, and some folks are commenting that, you know, in some cases conflict feels like negotiation, right, that there's an opportunity to hear both sides, to understand what people's positions and interests are, and to work through them, but there's absolutely communication that's happening between these individuals. We have a question about just reviewing fight and flight. We've used language like that as we've gone through the session. Michelle, do you have some thoughts on differentiating between fight and flight as it relates to conflict?
Well, you know, actually I always like to look at fight and flight as two ends of the spectrum. you know, either one done solely and with, you know, 100% effort can both, neither of them deal with conflict well. You're either totally avoiding it or you're being totally aggressive and not taking the other person's opinions into account. What we try to do through, you know, systematic approaches to managing conflict is we try to get people into the middle of that spectrum and ease them from whatever way their tendencies are. So for example, if your tendency is to run, we want to try and work you into the middle area where you start to deal with conflict, let's say using the AEIOU model. Similarly, for those whose instinct is to fight, again, to massage them over to the middle of the spectrum so that they are also dealing with the conflict in a systematic way.
Okay. So again, just some more, I'm just processing all of the commentary that's coming in because we've got a lot of questions, and every situation is unique, right, Michelle? Like there's a lot of different things that are at play with individuals and the specific situation and the history that might be involved. So the guideline is that. It's a guideline that needs to be adapted to your own individual situation. But we do have a question about intervention. Like at what point do you ask for help? At what point do you ask for somebody to facilitate a discussion between two individuals? And how would you manage that?
Well, I think any time that the working relationship has eroded to the point where, you know, productivity is in question, or somebody is going to leave the organization, or, you know, the business impacts are being felt, you do have to get the help of a third party. Now, depending on your organizational structure and who the conflict is between, for some people that would be going to, let's say, the Human Resources Department. In other cases, it may be to go to a neutral third party. But I think when you feel that you've exhausted all your efforts, you know, using a lot of the best practices we just talked about today, when you've exhausted those efforts, to go and take it to the next level, but of course making the other person or parties aware that that is what is going to happen, and again, not to just spring it on them, as it were.
Yeah. And I think in any relationship, when things are partnership or, you know, colleagues, if there's any time where things start going off the rails, both parties know it, but it takes the courage of one party to admit that there's an opportunity or need to address it, right?
Yeah, certainly, certainly.
Yeah. All right. Well, again, we had so many questions that were coming in. We are coming close to the end of the webinar. We do want to just reinforce that CMC does have conflict management workshops available. So several different courses. We have a one-day conflict management workshop, a two-day program that is targeted specifically at leaders, and another three-day workshop that Michelle has delivered for us, which is responding to conflict. So what's noted up here are the upcoming dates, but you can feel free to either call us or check on our website for any additional details on the course outlines. We do want to know what you're thinking, so we really appreciate all of your commentary today, but if you have ideas for us, feedback on today, what worked, what you'd like to see us do differently, other topics you're interested in, at the end of the session today, you'll get a pop-up that will ask you for feedback, so please take a minute to complete our post-webinar survey. We love hearing your comments and suggestions, and for those of you who have requested conflict in the past, you can see that we're listening. Additional resources are also available on our website, so feel free to visit us at www.cmcoutperform.com. And Michelle, I want to thank you so much for having the courage to deal with conflict in a 1-hour time slot. It's not an easy task to take on, but we really appreciate you sharing your thoughts and your insights and approach to managing these situations.
Thank you very much, Christina, and thank you all for your time and attention today.
And again, thanks all of you for your active participation online. We will be following up with a summary of the recording, so you should receive that in about 48 hours. You'll get access to the PowerPoint slides as well as the session recording, so you'll have an opportunity to revisit that for additional insight. But we wish you all the best of luck. We look forward to hearing from you, and thank you so much for joining us.